Welcome everyone to today's webinar on ransomware, Understanding Emerging Threats. I'm Peter Lambert, security expert and blogger here at Diamond IT. So in today's webinar, our agenda is first of all looking at evolving threats. The threats are changing fast, and it's not all about money now, as these attacks are also hitting non-internet connected resources. We'll talk about that more later. Exploiting organizations. Their attacks are directed at governments, businesses, private users all across the board. How to protect yourself, how to ward them off, what you can do to ward off ransomware and destruction of service attacks. And help, I've been compromised. What do you do when you're infected? How to deal with a security compromise. In the past 2 months, we've seen two very large ransomware events, the WannaCry and the Petya crypto worms. WannaCry and Petya made very little money, but they caused a great deal of damage. The damage was widespread due to an exploit of a Microsoft feature called Server Message Block, SMB. And through that exploit, they were able to infect other PCs that were not necessarily connected to the internet. And through that, especially with Windows XP being extremely vulnerable, they're able to infect some pretty significant networks, including Renault Motors, Maersk, International Shipping Company, and closer to home in Australia, the Mondello food company, and therefore the Cadbury chocolate factory. Lessons were learned from the WannaCry and Petya attacks that even though they made very little money through ransom, they caused a lot of damage, and therefore this provides leverage to ransom organizations. This is known as DDoS, or destruction of services. DDoS is one we're probably already familiar with. That's a distributed denial of service, and that's another way which we could see ransoms being leveraged in the future. End users, that's us. We remain the most effective attack vector still. It's expected we'll see more targeted attacks, which is known as spear phishing, and they'll likely leverage previous hacks where they've had users' information or passwords, along with public available data such as what's available on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, etc., just in general Google searches, to craft specific attacks. And blended attacks is the idea when you mix different attacks together. In WannaCry and Petya, they were a mix of social engineering, worm infection spreading, and crypto locking. If you add spear phishing to these methods, a directed attack, you can imagine a very sophisticated threat. So back to WannaCry. 12th of May it released, and it was the first one to use the Eternal Blue exploit, which is believed to have originated from the USA security organization, the NSA. So WannaCry, or WCry, or WDecryptor, it was notable for this use of the vulnerability, the SMB protocol. Now Windows XP, its SMB version is 1.0, and that's the one that is vulnerable. From Windows Vista on, they used SMB 2, but still had the previous one enabled for backwards compatibility, and that's where this attack was effective. The main focus of the attack for WannaCry was actually through remote desktop servers, not so much social engineering, and that's an attack vector that's become pretty popular for this and other more successful, as far as money-wise, ransomware such as Locky. So the most successful strain of WannaCry attacked remote desktop servers through the public internet. So this is a practice that we at Diamond have been trying to eliminate for the last year. We want all of our clients to have their remote desktop servers behind a VPN, which effectively eliminates this attack vector. Now, once it got onto a network through an internet-connected PC, it would spread itself through hidden administrative shares on the PCs. And this is how it spread so widely. And some of these PCs that were decrypted were running equipment, running robots and other construction material. Because they're on the network, but not connected to the internet, they were not seen as being vulnerable, but they were. And typical of ransomware, WannaCry would come up, it would demand money, rising ransom in Bitcoin to put pressure on users and try and get them to rush into paying the money. Of those who paid the money, though, it was that initially that successful that a good number of the ransoms weren't actually returned with the key, and therefore the ransom was paid but not returned. The data was not returned. So we moved to NotPetya. It's around 6 weeks later, after WannaCry, Petya came out. NotPetya came out, also known as Petya or GoldenEye. That's a James Bond reference if you picked that up. So NotPetya used the same SMB exploit as did WannaCry. Just like WannaCry, it was a combination of a traditional ransomware attack, but it also was a worm where it would spread across the network using that SMB exploit. Now, it was a very destructive attack, especially in Ukraine and somewhat in Russia. It was actually distributed through a tax software application very popular in Ukraine called MEDoc, and the attack was caused by hacking this tax software and in its update adding this ransomware virus worm, crypto worm. So people who updated their tax software, ready to start doing their taxes for the new financial year, have actually launched an attack on their own network. And from there, it spread across networks. And there is the big thing about NotPetya is basically it was it wasn't really a ransom. There was a single email that was used to a public email provider, so it was blocked almost immediately. So even if you paid your ransom, you weren't going to get your PCs back. It was a little bit different to WannaCry in that it wasn't encrypting files, it was encrypting the entire hard drive master boot record, which meant that that entire PC was basically useless and you had to restore it fresh, bare metal restore. So with these recent attacks, what we're expecting to see, and this is from Cisco, from some of their information, is that we humans are still the weakest point, and user action is continuing to be leveraged as the primary source of infection. So they use us as a way to start their attack, to get around the security settings that are in Windows. Remote ransomware as a service, RAAS, so you've heard of platform as a service, internet as a service, software as a service. You can even buy ransomware on the dark web. So developers decide they would like to make the money without taking the risk of being caught and put in jail for 20 years. So the skilled programmers will put together these packages of ransomware, and then you have the attackers will buy that, customize it, and then put it out there. Basically, it's being commoditized, and that means there's a chance of more and more attacks. Fileless malware is making an entrance into the future threats horizon. It's extremely difficult to detect. Thankfully, for now, it's also very difficult to deploy and to spread. So that's a piece of malware that doesn't actually write to the hard drive. It exists only in RAM. So it exists only in static memory. And along with the idea of combining different aspects of malware together, or blended or attack, we've also seen how malware developers have been improving how they anonymize and they decentralize the command and control of their malware. So this is a weakness that was exposed when WannaCry was quickly killed by a kill switch. This is something that they're getting cleverer about. It's going to be harder to stop in such a fashion in the future. So how do we keep them out? Our recommendations remain pretty much the same. First of all, eliminating operating systems, legacy operating systems, those prior to Windows 10 remains the highest priority. Windows XP is a huge liability, and even for non-connected systems, remains a very weak point in your security platform. So yeah, just not having it connected to the internet is not enough protection anymore. If it's on the network at all, it's vulnerable. And even still, if people plug in USB drives into a XP machine that runs a piece of machinery, then there's a very good chance it could be infected and destroyed. Regular updates remain very important, and very much so. Not Petya largely required people not to have the most recent updates for it to work. Not talking about the ME.doc program that was compromised, but just in general in Windows. That regular updates also applies to not just the software, but also the firmware on your hardware, etc. Number 3 is protect your network entry and exit points with a firewall device. So now we have what they call next generation firewalls, or UTMs, Unified Threat Management Devices. These are not just a router and firewall, but they also provide filtering, anti-malware, sandbox, intrusion detection, all of those features for both incoming and outgoing data. So in the early days of firewalls, they would just block ports, stopping data coming in to certain ports, but not checking at the application level. This is what the new next generation firewalls, these UTMs, do. And they will filter all the way up to the application level and take a lot more control of what comes in and out of your network. Educate your staff. As I mentioned before, training your employees about cybersecurity is still one of the most important pieces, because we are still the most vulnerable and most popular attack vector for these cyber attacks. Maintaining best practice. This is regarding including security in your planning, in your budgeting, and disaster recovery as well as part of that. Not just your best practices in data operations, but also in backup and restore. Have a disaster plan and practice it, and have offsite and unattached backups. What do you do if you're infected? Well, start off, it's safest just to pull the power out of that PC. You don't even want to do a graceful shutdown. That gives the malware the opportunity to complete some of its preparation of its infection. As we've seen with this SMB exploit, these crypto worms will immediately start spreading across the network. So these can happen in seconds. It's very important to pull the plug as quick as possible. Call your IT provider, your services provider, as soon as you can. Minutes can make a difference in arresting the speed of these attacks. And finally, if you're infected, it's almost always the case now that you're going to have to restore from backup. So I'll say again, these offline backups are hugely important. If those network stored backups are infected, you've got to have something to fall back to. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into our resources relating to cybersecurity, ransomware specifically, we have an online security assessment available to everyone for no cost. Go ahead and run through that. This webinar is one of a series, so you can review this webinar and those we've had before at our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us. My name is Peter Lambert. We hope you find this webinar was helpful, and enjoy your feedback here in chat or on our YouTube channel after the event.